Well, it's 6 o'clock. So good evening, everyone, and welcome again to the Oxford Interfaith Forum reading groups on sacred literature in an interfaith context. This is the second in the series of reading groups devoted to sacred literature, in this case on the topic of Revelation, incorporating its multitude of meanings. Sacred literature of all faiths is distinguished from the non-sacred, not really by any criteria of style or literary form, but because of its divine origin, which sets it apart from other literature and makes it more authoritative than any other writings. As the Book of Common Prayer has it, the words of Scripture are given by God so that we may hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them. There's also a body of supplementary literature that is theoretically less sacred, but has a vital relationship with the sources. What this series of reading groups is trying to do is to explore a variety of sacred literature and reflect on its role as a source of inspiration and revelation in various interfaith contexts. Here I would like to quote Owen Barfield, the British philosopher, who ends his lecture on literature and revelation entitled The Concept of Revelation with these words. The principal concern of this paper has been with literature, though its object has been to suggest that a healthy future for both literature and religion depends on what I would call the idea of literature coalescing, as it were, with the idea of religion in an evolutionary concept of revelation. End of quote. The series therefore aims to discuss these texts with attention to their qualities as literary masterpieces, in addition to their eternal value as sacred texts. Literature is a huge and varied topic, even more so than Revelation, I think. All the scriptures use literary techniques and devices, for example, parables, figures of speech, narrative, characterizations, imagery, among many others. This can be within the framework of the aesthetics of the sacred texts themselves, or in relation to other literary, even modern texts, as we saw in the first lecture in this series. But in addition to their manifold literary qualities, we aim to consider how these texts have been adapted and changed, how exegetical usages of passages of these texts have been changed and developed, how they have been used in different and maybe even secular contexts, how religious and literary texts interact and influence each other. We also explore the processes of appropriation and reinterpretation of teaching and practices of other religions as a form of textual dialogue. Partly because these texts are revered, they're often regarded as fossilized, but historically they were regularly repurposed to inspire new revelations. There is a multitude of other topics within our framework which I hope will be explored in future sessions. But now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our second speaker in this series, Professor John Barton. Now, Professor Barton has had such a distinguished career that if I were to list all of his achievements, I would take away most of his lecture time. So I'm just going to, I'll mention only a few. In 1974, Professor Barton was elected a Fellow of St. Cross College, Oxford, and appointed a university lecturer in theology, in Old Testament theology, and the reader in biblical studies in 1989. In 1991, he was appointed Oriel and Lane Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture and elected a Fellow of Oriel College, Oxford. From 2010 to 2013, he held a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship for work on a project entitled Ethics in Ancient Israel. Since 2014, Professor Barton has been a Senior Research Fellow of Campion Hall, a Jesuit-run permanent private hall of the University of Oxford. In 1973, Professor Barton was ordained in the Church of England as a deacon and priest. He served on the Church's General Synod representing the clergy of the University of Oxford for 6 years. In 2007, Professor Barton was elected a Fellow of the British Academy, FBA. He is also a corresponding Fellow of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. In 1998, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of theology by the University of Bonn. Professor Barton has published a huge number of books on scripture. Among them is his great A History of the Bible, The Book and Its Face, published in 2019, which won the 2019 Duff Cooper Prize. And there is a forthcoming book to be published in November, The Word, on the translation of the Bible. I could go on, but we need the time for Professor Barton's own words. So the title of his presentation is The Book of Isaiah and the Christian Quest for Revelation. after his presentation, there will be some time for questions and discussion. So John, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Glenda, for that introduction, which is very kind. It's very nice to be introduced by a fellow of St. Cross, having been one myself, and now being an Emeritus Fellow. Well, I'm talking about the book of Isaiah and the Christian quest for revelation. If a religion accepts an authoritative body of writings, you might expect that the religion would correspond point by point with the content of those writings. And there may be religions of which that's true, but in practice they're harder to find than you might think. Both Judaism and Christianity appeal to sacred texts, but in both cases there's a certain gap between the religion as actually practiced and the texts of the scriptures that are venerated. The New Testament is a reasonable match with at least some forms of Christianity, though both it and they are very diverse. And certainly the New Testament and the Christian faith aren't identical. But where the Hebrew Bible is concerned, in its relation to Judaism, things are perhaps even more complicated. Judaism, as we know it today, is obviously not identical with the various religious traditions enshrined in the Hebrew Bible, nor does it claim to be. It recognizes that things have developed since biblical times. When I was appointed in 1974 to a lectureship in Old Testament studies, as Glenda recalled, the great Gezer Vermesh said to me, seriously and appropriately and warningly, don't imagine that just because you study the Old Testament, that means you know about Judaism. And that's a warning I've always tried to take to heart. In this talk, though, I'm concerned with Christian reading of the Hebrew Bible, so crossing that line between Judaism and Christianity and New and Old Testament. And there things are, if anything, more complex still. Christians have always affirmed that what they call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is to be regarded as part of their scriptures. To deny that the Old Testament is part of scripture is to commit the earliest recognized heresy in Christianity, known as Martianism, after Marcion, a 2nd century CE teacher from what's now Turkey, who preached in Rome that the God of the Old Testament was quite different from the God of the New and entirely undesirable. Now, this is a belief still often encountered among Christians today, who frequently think, as Marcion did, that the picture of God in the Old Testament is of a harsh and punishing divinity as compared with the New Testament God, who is loving and kind. Worse still, they then go on to equate this supposedly harsher Old Testament God with the God believed in now by Jews, and the kind New Testament one with the God Christians believe in, and they end up contrasting Judaism with Christianity on that basis. And they then go on to reject the Old Testament for all practical purposes and Judaism with it. This is very muddled, but it's difficult to talk many Christians out of. I'm often asked by people in church, why do we still read the Old Testament when it's obviously outdated in the light of Jesus? There's no doubt that such a set of beliefs was, perhaps surprisingly, condemned by the church before the end of the 2nd century, but it still survives. So Christians have always at least officially insisted that the Old Testament should be part of the Christian Bible, and that the New Testament on its own is not enough. But that doesn't mean that they've read the Old Testament at face value, as we might put it, and still less that they've read it as Jews read it. On the contrary, they've read the Old Testament as if it gave out a distinctly Christian message. They've insisted against Marcion that the Old Testament runs seamlessly into the New as part of the same revelation from the one God both Christians and Jews worship. But that's meant reading it very much in the light of the New Testament, not as a freestanding work with its own integrity. And it's seldom noticed how strange this is, seldom noticed by Christians anyway. The Hebrew Bible is an important collection of ancient literary texts of high quality. And that's definitely true of the book of Isaiah, which I'm going to talk about this evening. But Christianity has treated the Old Testament as a source for its own system of belief and practice. And to do that, it's had to read it, to put it politely, rather creatively. In this talk, I want to concentrate on the Christian reading of Isaiah, understood as an implicitly Christian text, and try to illustrate the literary methods and techniques that that's traditionally required. Jewish readings of the Bible, of course, also interpret it in ways that fit with later non-biblical perspectives, but there isn't time to illustrate that in this talk, though I will mention it briefly at the end. But first, it's worth reflecting on how strange it is to take an existing body of religious scriptures and read them as if they were the scriptures of a very different religion, which is what Christians did with the Old Testament. To suggest an imperfect secular analogy, imagine if we took the American Constitution and decided to read it as if it were a British Constitution, insisting that references into American realities and customs and laws were really to be read as referring to British ones, and we twisted the interpretation of it so that that was possible. That's about how strange a Christian use of the Old Testament can actually be. And the book of Isaiah is a particularly good place to see the process in action. To underline the title of this talk, indeed the title of the series, Christians have gone to Isaiah looking for revelation of God's laws and requirements, but above all, revelation of the coming of the Messiah, and proof that that Messiah is Jesus. Isaiah contains more than the other prophetic books that serve this kind of reading. It contains a lot of chapters and verses on the theme of kingship. The texts about this had their original context in the reality of the Judean monarchy of kings of the line of David, to whom Isaiah may have been a royal counselor in the 8th century BCE. But the sayings preserved in the book about the king often refer not just to contemporary kings, but to a kind of greater king. In Second Temple Judaism, they came to be seen as messianic texts, predicting the arrival of a kind of super king, a king to end all kings, which is broadly what the Messiah, the anointed one in Hebrew, refers to in the prophetic books, though actually the word occurs very seldom. But compared with relatively restrained Jewish messianism, Christianity, of course, was characterized from the beginning by a huge explosion of interest in the Messiah, and that, of course, was because the Messiah was identified as Jesus. So the texts that can be read as messianic were immediately appropriated by Christians, and some think already by Jesus himself, as prophecies of him. Many of these texts are read in church around Christmas. And if you ever watch the 9 lessons and carols from King's College, Cambridge on Christmas Eve, you'll hear them read. And they're also prominent in Handel's oratorio Messiah. Here are a couple of typical examples. Isaiah 9 says, "A child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he's named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time onwards and forevermore." Or then again in Isaiah 11, "A shoot shall come out from the stock of Jesse," that's to say David's father, "and a branch shall grow out of his roots, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them." You can see how Christians saw something there that they could appropriate. And thirdly, interpreted by Christians as referring to Jesus's trial and crucifixion, there's Isaiah 53, which refers to the sufferings of the servant of the Lord, whose identity is never revealed, which have some kind of vicarious significance for the whole nation, not identified as the Messiah, but interpreted as such very easily. And the text says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away, cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people." Now again, Christians saw that as fulfilled in the sufferings of Jesus. Judaism also came to see some of these passages as messianic, but of course, not as speaking about Jesus. Now, Christians went to these texts in search of revelation, thinking that they would get from them information revealed by God about what the Messiah was to be like, and consequently what Jesus would be like, or must have been like. They saw Isaiah as complementing what's recorded about Jesus in the Gospels, so much so that in early Christian writers, the book of Isaiah is occasionally referred to as the fifth Gospel, because it had so much material in it that Christians could apply to Jesus. And there are two strands in Christian thinking about this. One is that the texts already widely accepted in Judaism as messianic are really about Jesus, who was the Messiah. The second strand is that more texts are messianic than Jews had previously believed to be messianic, so that from those two we can learn more about Jesus. So you magnify the number of texts that it's possible to refer to. And that's clear in that so-called servant song that I read, the third passage I read. As on Good Friday, it's read in Christian tradition to reflect on Jesus' suffering on the cross. And Christians did indeed find fresh information about him by this route. And that may then have led to additions to the gospel narratives themselves. For example, the Gospels record the silence of Jesus before Pilate at his trial. And that may, of course, be historically true, but it could also have been deduced from Isaiah 53, "He did not open his mouth." The passages in Isaiah and in the Gospels started to form a sort of web of interconnections, in which the fact that some were in the New Testament and others in the Old ceased to matter. Both Testaments came to be seen as parts of a unified Christian Bible, and hence the rejection of Martianism, who said that we must reject the Old Testament. I'm sorry to say that rejection wasn't a matter of Christian respect for Judaism and its scriptures. It was a defense of the idea that Old and New Testament fit together as two slices of the same cake. It's part of a thorough Christianizing of the whole biblical text, not at all intended as a warning against anti-Semitism, much as we might wish that it were. Now, modern biblical scholars, both Christians and Jews, have tended to say that this way of reading the text of Isaiah is really a distortion of it, historically indefensible. Early Christians were reading the Old Testament scriptures against the grain. To put it bluntly, they were reading Christian meanings into those texts rather than actually getting fresh revelation out of them. They did turn to the Old Testament texts like Isaiah for information or revelation, but they already knew pretty much what that information would be. They were practicing what biblical scholarship often describes using a made-up pseudo-Greek word as eisegesis, the opposite of exegesis. Exegesis is supposed to mean reading something out of the text, getting meaning out of it. And eisegesis is a coinage to mean the opposite, reading things into the text that aren't really there. Christians went to Isaiah with ideas that came from their own thinking. And then they went on, surprise, surprise, to discover that those ideas were already in the text, that they put them there themselves. It sounds like a wholly disreputable procedure. You may think I'm not doing Christianity any favors, and you may wonder why I'm still a Christian after saying that kind of thing. Now, modern Christians who know that this is what happened do start to feel uneasy about using the Old Testament at all in church. not for anti-Semitic or Marcionite reasons, but because a scholarly analysis shows that it really had little to say that is actually relevant to the idea of Jesus as the Messiah. It just provides convenient verbal pegs on which to hang Christian thoughts. So you read about a child being born to us and you think, that's the birth of Jesus at Christmas, and so on. But it's a convenient text to use, but it didn't originally mean that. Isaiah has become, in effect, a collection of images or pictures or snippets of text that Christians could use to help them say what they wanted to say anyway, and to claim that Isaiah had predicted it all. So seen in this perspective, Christians really misappropriated the ancient Jewish scriptures and used them to make Christian points, often torturing the words of the text in the process, rather as would happen if you go back to my imaginary example about Brits reading the American Constitution as if it were their own. This implies that Christian insistence on retaining the Old Testament was mainly because its texts had been, we would say, misread as though they were Christian texts, so that accepting them in the church was at best a backhanded compliment to their Jewish writers. Yes, they said these books, especially Isaiah, are authoritative scripture, but only because we read them as if they were Christian texts in origin anyway. And this certainly sounds dishonest. And I think it's a problem for dialogue between Judaism and Christianity that isn't always acknowledged when Christians claim that after all the two religions share the Hebrew Bible. That's the thing that Christians say a lot, we share the Hebrew Bible with you. But I think they're sometimes not in very good faith in saying that, because we share it, but we read it so differently that it's almost as though it were a different book. It can be rather a glib failure to recognize that Christians have not so much accepted the Old Testament as annexed it, which is not quite the same thing. So that's the sort of confession to start with. Is there any way of taking a more positive view of all this? Can a Christian who's honest about it still attend a Christmas carol service in good conscience? Well, here's one suggestion, which I don't feel confident about, but which I think is just worth examining and that you might want to discuss. This series is about literary aspects of religious texts that readers go to experience revelation. What I've described so far is a historical description of how the book of Isaiah, indeed the Hebrew Bible in general, was appropriated by the early Christian movement and how it came to be read as if it formed a seamless whole with the New Testament. And this is a literary investigation in a sense, in that obviously it concerns a piece of ancient literature. But it isn't what critics today would regard as a very literary undertaking. From a modern literary critical point of view, it looks maybe interesting, but really rather old-fashioned. It sets up a clash between the text's supposed original meaning as intended by its author or authors and its later reception in ever-changing contexts, and says that only the first is valid, the meaning it had for the original writers. The notion that the text's meaning for the reader depends on the context it's being read in, and therefore that can change over time, this view regards, that I've been putting forward, regards as illegitimate, forced, or even deplorable. What's being rejected here includes the idea that meaning is plastic rather than fixed, that the reuse of old texts in new contexts is absolutely wrong. It argues that we shouldn't sit loose to the original author's intention, but should be interested in the text in separation from what the author meant. Now, none of this is likely to strike a student of literature today as all that strange or alien, I think. Certainly not as dishonest or unnatural. The idea that texts take on new meanings in new contexts is quite familiar in modern literary studies, though it isn't probably in biblical criticism. At least since the 1960s and 70s, with the rejection of the so-called intentional fallacy in studying literature, there's been a concern for the reception history of literary texts and their effect on successive generations of readers as a key to their possible meaning, not just an interest in what the original author meant. And these ideas have become so commonplace that, far from being revolutionary, in much study of literature, they're almost stale or boring by now. The much discussed death of the author in literary studies as the arbiter of the meaning of the text liberates texts to yield meanings the author was unaware of or couldn't have been aware of. What struck earlier biblical critics as a sort of shiftiness and illegitimacy in traditional Christian reading of the prophets might nowadays be seen as just a rather normal way of reading. The text means something new because it's being read in a new context. Texts mean what they've been taken to mean, we might say. The meaning of a text is the history of the text's reception. Now, on that literary rather than religious foundation, reading the book of Isaiah as delivering a Christian message might start to look completely acceptable again, not at all underhand or illegitimate. Of course, from a traditional Christian perspective, even the idea that the book of Isaiah can legitimately be read as revealing Jesus as the Messiah doesn't go far enough. Early Christians didn't claim that their reading of biblical texts as pointing to Jesus was one permissible way of reading them. They insisted that it was the only permissible way. It uncovered the one true meaning of the scriptural books, as against other, and especially Jewish modes of reading them, which were incorrect in their view. So the motivation for reading Old Testament books in this way wasn't literary, it was religious. Nevertheless, I think it's worth pointing out how similar, formally speaking, a traditional Jesus-centered reading of the Old Testament is to readings of secular texts by some literary critics since the mid-20th century. Both in continental Europe, since the rise of things like structuralism, and in the English-speaking world where the so-called new criticism prevailed, texts started to be interpreted in the 20th century without regard to their author's intentions, as free-floating works whose meaning could easily encompass ideas the author couldn't have known about. And against that kind of background, we could say the early Christians read the Bible rather as literary critics in the last century or so have read many secular texts. The similarity may be coincidental, but it's close enough to suggest that the modern literary analogy could be used to make the early Christian procedure seem acceptable, even natural. And rejecting it as improper wouldn't show critical intelligence so much as naivety about how textual meaning works in general. So along those literary lines, you might sort of rehabilitate early Christian reading by saying, well, they read the text as meaning something different in their day than it had originally meant. And texts always do mean something different in the current day than they meant originally. So perhaps it's okay after all. So that if we read the book of Isaiah as referring to Jesus, we are moving beyond anything likely to have been in Isaiah's own mind. And since the rise of Enlightenment biblical criticism, theologians have tended to object to that. They've called it pre-critical. But nowadays you might call it post-critical and you might see it once more as perfectly legitimate. Isaiah did not really predict the coming of Jesus, and the book attributed to Isaiah was not really a precursor of the Gospels. Yet what, after all, does really mean in sentences like that? Isn't there a sense, as Borges, for example, put it, that writers create their own precursors and establish meaning in them, and even links between them that no one at the time saw or even could have seen? Isaiah and other ancient scriptural writers can be seen as forming a kind of web of shared allusion and interaction, when seen in the light not of what preceded them, but of what followed them. Christian reading has turned Isaiah into a prequel of the Gospels, you might say. What came to be said about Jesus and the early Christian movement in the Gospels and the writing of St. Paul retrospectively revealed meanings in Isaiah and relations between Isaiah and other texts that hadn't been seen till then. You could even go further and say meanings that hadn't existed until then, but do now. That would be a sort of literary way of thinking about these things. And along these lines, it would be possible to argue that Christianizing readings of Isaiah are defensible after all. We know that in life, the present and future can't affect the past, but in literature, perhaps they can. T.S. Eliot, for example, argued that a new work of literature of any stature has the effect of rearranging existing works of literature into a new alignment. Maybe that's what the New Testament does to the Old. Or to put it more humbly, for Christians it does anyway, even though they shouldn't impose that idea on other readers, and particularly not on Jewish readers. But for Christians, the Old Testament is realigned towards Jesus, just as the canon of literature is realigned when a new work appears, according to Eliot. And maybe that makes Christian reading of the Old Testament all right after all. So I'm just trying to suggest a way of possibly undermining some of the things I said earlier. But I have myself hesitations about even a modest version of this suggestion. This is first because in some ways it lets Christians off the hook too easily. It seems to say, you've just shown that Isaiah wasn't really foretelling Jesus, but you don't need to worry about that now, because recent literary theories can relieve you of the problem. Because all texts interact and form a great web or internet of connections, which have nothing to do with authors and their intentions, then you can read Isaiah messianically if you like, and in a Christian way, to your heart's content. The Gospels can explain Isaiah just as much as Isaiah can explain the Gospels. The Bible is not primarily a historical document, but a literary work in which themes crisscross without regard to before and after. Literary theory, of course, in its many forms is much more subtle and sophisticated than I'm making it sound. Putting it like this explains its attractions for some biblical interpreters, though it also helps to explain why it seems to me, though it's rather seductive, too good to be true. A second reason why I'd hesitate before buying into this kind of intertextual treatment of the book of Isaiah is its possible anti-Jewish implications. The Hebrew Bible is surely not a Christian book, it is a Jewish book. Granted that the Judaism that underlies the Hebrew Bible is not Judaism as we encounter it today, because just like Christianity, Judaism has developed in many non-biblical directions. And on the other hand, Christianity is not a religion wholly alien from the Hebrew Bible, because it was in origin a Jewish sect. So that to say starkly that Christians stole the Bible from Jews is an exaggeration and an oversimplification. But nevertheless, it would be absurd to deny that the Christian Bible is a Jewish rather than a Christian product. After all, there were no Christians around when it was being written. And to do as the early church did and insist that its real meaning is the meaning attributed to it by Christians might be acceptable as part of a slightly playful sort of postmodern reading. But to affirm it really seriously is to ignore what damage Christians have done to Judaism by annexing the Hebrew Bible, as though that were a small matter. And it can quickly morph into the belief, not uncommon among Christians, that later Judaism was a false development from the Hebrew Bible, that it's superfluous and ought not to exist, which many Christian, even biblical scholars, believed in the past. The stakes in all this are too high for it to be dismissed on the grounds of recent literary theory. When applied to the Bible, an approach that defends a distinctively Christian way of reading a book such as Isaiah on the basis of 20th and 21st century literary theory can have the effect of aiding and abetting Christian attempts to wrestle the Old Testament away from Jewish readers and assert exclusive ownership of it. And I'm naturally unhappy about accepting an approach that could even unintentionally lead to that. Seems to me rather better for Christians to acknowledge honestly that many of the texts in Isaiah and elsewhere that in our tradition are characteristically used as if they pointed forward to Jesus don't do so, even though as images we may want to use them because they're evocative, but that's a long way from actually asserting that they really are prophecies of Jesus. To argue that it's all right to affirm a traditional Christian reading of Isaiah and to reject a Jewish one simply because it can be justified through a kind of theory of reader response criticism appears harmless, but it suddenly gets us into very deep water indeed, because it can be heard as claiming against Jewish readings that these texts are ours and not yours any longer. And that's what many early Christians actually believed, and what modern believers can all too easily believe. And if you see that as the takeaway message when a prophetic book such as Isaiah is read in church, then that's really rather disturbing. So I'm not wholly comfortable with attempts to rehabilitate the early Christian treatment of the Hebrew Bible as really a form of Christian scripture by appealing to current literary theory. It gives Christian interpreters a very easy ride, but the price is too high because it can also easily help Christians to ignore the fact that these texts are also part of Judaism. Just before I conclude, though, there is another and perhaps paradoxical side to the story. You see that my pendulum is swinging constantly to and fro in this. And the paradox is that contemporary literary approaches to text, such as you might deploy to defend the Christian reading of Isaiah, are actually in some ways rather close to traditional Jewish methods of textual interpretation. The now canonical literary critics, such as Barth, Derrida, and Kristeva, often draw on the midrashic approach found in traditional Jewish commentary, which was already deeply intertextual and not much concerned with the original intentions of the authors, many centuries before their time. Rabbinic Judaism seldom appeals to the Bible in its literal surface meaning, any more than Christians have done. It sees deeper meanings hidden below the surface of the biblical text. Like the Quran, as described by the last speaker in this series, the Bible is seen as saturated with meaning. And the Jewish method of extracting this meaning is often to locate other texts elsewhere in the Bible that can provide an interpretative key to any passage that's being studied. In reading Derrida, for example, we can easily be reminded of Midrash. And this is no accident, since Derrida, who was himself of Jewish heritage, knew a great deal about Midrashic interpretation and often drew on it explicitly. So far as Isaiah is concerned, it's not only Christians that have combed it for predictions of the future by practicing Midrashic methods on it. Isaiah has been an important book in Judaism too. For example, it's the book that contributes the greatest number of passages to the list of prophetic readings, the Haftarot, used in synagogue worship to complement the reading from the Torah. Jews have sought revelation from Isaiah just as Christians have, even if often a different kind of revelation, and the methods they've used for that have in some cases resurfaced in structuralism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, and other contemporary or recent literary theory. Theory-driven readings of all texts nowadays are not so dissimilar from traditional Jewish readings of the Bible. So that's a bit of a paradox against what I've been saying. So let me now just sum up, if I may, for a few more minutes. Once we look closely at the arguments that swirl around Christian use of a book like Isaiah, we find a number of paradoxes and puzzles. I've tried to make 5 points which oscillate to and fro rather unhelpfully from positive to negative, which I hope at least illustrate how far from obvious the whole issue is. First, Christians have traditionally maintained that the book of Isaiah is a source of divine revelation, particularly on the subject of the Messiah. At first sight, this seems to be a positive Christian attitude to Jewish scripture, a sense that we too venerate this massively important piece of Jewish scripture and see it as an essential part of the Bible for us too. On closer inspection, however, it turns out, secondly, that Christians have affirmed the Old Testament and a book like Isaiah, mainly or even solely because they read Christian meanings into it, thus turning it in effect into a Christian book. And this is not nearly such good news for Jewish-Christian relations as the idea that we somehow share Isaiah might initially have seemed. Accepting the holy status or authority of a book, but only because you can read it as though it said the things you wanted to say anyway, is, as I put it, a rather backhanded compliment to the book and immediately undermines the sense that it's shared. But thirdly, before we reject this out of hand as just a kind of Christian imperialism, I suggested we might like to consider the possibility that a Christianizing reading can be supported on the basis of contemporary trends, such as reader response criticism, reception history, and other literary theoretical approaches to texts in general. Though I find this possibility attractive, I also think, fourthly, that it's a bit too convenient for Christians and can all too easily seem to justify the rather ridiculous idea that Isaiah isn't really meant for Jewish readers anyway, but for Christians, which again produces a very undesirable Christian takeover of the Hebrew Bible. And yet, fifthly and finally, readings of texts informed by critical theory are not necessarily Christian in origin and latently supersessionist. On the contrary, they're sometimes quite close to traditional Jewish ways of reading the Bible. They're often midrashic in style and practice a way of combining texts and themes from all over the Bible without regard to historical or chronological context, fulfilling the rabbinic maxim that there is no before and after in Scripture, that you can take texts from anywhere and combine them and make them mean, in a sense, what you like. And for a midrashic reading, just as for recent literary theory, the whole Bible is a kind of seamless web. And that suggests that the Christian tendency to interpret the book of Isaiah in the light of what followed it, the story of Jesus as told in the New Testament, could after all be seen as not so illegitimate, not quite so radically un-Jewish or anti-Jewish in style, even though obviously it comes to very un-Jewish conclusions. So I end my talk with no conclusion, but just a question. Are traditional Christian readings of a book such as Isaiah legitimate or not? And I don't know the answer. I think it's a puzzle, and there are things to be said both ways, and I've tried to say a few of them without committing myself to any of them. So I haven't got a position in a way, but all I have got, I hope, is a way of setting out what some of the issues are. So I'd be very interested to hear what you think. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much. That was very provocative, and I'm sure that there will be quite a lot of discussion. And I just think it's wonderful how you moved from, as you said, the pendulum oscillated from appropriation to literary theory to midrash and back again. Oh, by the way, the author is alive again. The author is back.
You ought to come back now, yes.
Part of theory is now past. Yes, the author is allowed once again.
My theory is now, my literary theory is now already out of date.
I'm afraid so. I'm afraid so. So I would like to, I'm sure there must be a lot of questions and discussion. Could you please indicate either by putting your hand up or by putting a hand in